Well then, BlizzConline is just a couple of days away. So we're gonna get a bunch of news regarding 9.1, which is gonna come out after 9.0.5. We have already covered most of the changes of 9.0.5. There's going to be some hype coming in. Some people are gonna get some more motivation to, for example, reroll, change their character, think and look forward towards a certain spec or a certain class. Maybe, for example, if Blizzard announces the double equipable legendary in 9.1 or some heavier reworks, for example, to specs like Mistweaver, specs like Protection Warrior, maybe even Holy Priest. So we're going to go through an advertisement video. An advertisement as well as an illustration as to why should you play a tank. We are going to go through all of the roles of the game, from tank to healer to melee DPS to range DPS, and look at why exactly you should be playing them. We are starting with tank because, of course, tanks are the more endangered species. You know, they are being hoarded in preservation retreats. You know, they are being taken care for, they are being monitored, they are making sure they don't go extinct. So it is something we need to keep an eye on. Why should you advise a newer player or a player interested in rerolling, in changing from their spec or their class and their role they have played for many years, many expansions, many tiers, whatever? Why should you tell them to go and play tank? Now, I haven't really conducted interviews and tons of psychological assessments of people as to why exactly there is such few tanks. The logical answer, of course, is that tanks are much less viable in terms of numbers, right? When you look at PvP, tanks are much less playable in the PvP environment. Yes, there are some, some weird things happening here and there. This time in Shadowlands there is Protection Paladin, which is pseudo-viable as a PvP spec. And then when you go back to the more, standard composition, in Mythic Plus it is 1 slot together with healer, and then in raids it's just 2. Some bosses sometimes have 3. Tanks, it was more prevalent in BFA than it is right now, at least in Shadowlands. So it is, of course, the least played role, also because it is the least in demand. However, many people feel like there is a lack of tanks, there is a scarcity of tanks, and they have problems finding and filling groups with tanks. Now, per personal experience, I can tell you that sometimes it is sort of a game of chicken, where when you look at Mythic Plus groups, Mythic Plus players are not going to join a group if there isn't a tank, and tanks are not going to join a group if the rest of the group isn't already made up. So you create this situation where nobody is joining, and as a result, no group is being formed. And on top of these problems, which makes tanks not very prevalent in the game, simply because of how little you need of them, just 1 or 2 most of the times, there is the other problem, which is more on the psychological side. It is more on the even emotional side, which is leading, which is accepting responsibility. You do have people that, I still remember this all the way back to things like StarCraft, where people have ladder anxiety, sort of having fear of measuring themselves against other people. And even though things like Mythic Plus, for example, aren't even against other people, they're just against the AI, they're against a Blizzard dungeon, people still don't want to feel judged at every move. They don't want to feel like the success of the key, of the Mythic Plus key, is holding more on their back than on the rest of the group. And if you had to pinpoint a specific role amongst the entire Mythic Plus key, then the tank and the healer are, of course, the ones where people are going to feel like there is more of a onus on them. Because, of course, DPS, there is 3 of them. So DPS, they miss an interrupt, yes, can be a problem. DPS, they step on bad, yes, can be a problem. But it is not as bad as when a healer fucks up or when a tank fucks up. This has created a situation where you have an entire group of people, an entire type, style of people. The ones that don't want too much responsibility are simply not going to go tank, first and foremost. They're also not going to go healers as much. They are mostly going to go DPS, but some of them healers as well. The one role they will go the least for is the tank. We also entered a few years ago a situation which really magnified this problem, because before Mythic Plus, we could even say sort of before challenge mode, tank was just a raid role, right? And as far as raids were concerned, tank was rather easy, it was rather simple, it didn't require too much of you as a player. Lots of patience, sure, but it wasn't very demanding. Even, the responsibility you had as a tank in a raid was much, much reduced. Raid encounters were having much more responsibility on DPS to do correctly all of the mechanics, all the things you had to dodge, the things you had to coordinate with the rest of your group, while for the most part, the tanks were just sitting in a corner watching the raid die for 50, 60, 70, 100 wipes. But since Mythic Plus was introduced, first in the form of challenge mode and then in Mythic Plus proper, there has been a heavy shift because now tanks held a lot of power. Now, if we are to try to advertise the tank role, is it right to say that this isn't really much of an issue you are going to encounter as a tank? No, it's not. You are going to have to take a lot of responsibility as a tank, and when you join a group, when you join a Mythic Plus group, even though the party leader is a DPS, even though 4 out of 5 people have higher Raider IO, higher experience than the tank, the one who is going to be expected to know the route, to know the path, and know the pulls is going to be the tank. And this is a lot of responsibility put on players. And we are figuring out, the deeper we go into this Mythic Plus activity, that many people don't want to go through that. Then you also have the problem of time. When you play DPS, it is very easy to just hop in a Mythic Plus key. The things you have to remember, the things you have to memorize as a DPSer are mostly which of their abilities are going to hurt the most, which are the abilities you can interrupt as a DPS or stun, similar things. So if you are one of the players on the casual side, playing less, having less time to play, but still you want to do Mythic Plus, still one of your goals, for example, is to do, Keystone Master, for example. You want to get to all of the dungeons done to plus 15, or maybe you want to go higher or lower, whichever is your goal. The easier one is, of course, going to be DPS, because you can just hop in and you don't have too much to remember, too much to keep in mind, too much to learn by trial and error. So learn by doing multiple keys of Mythic Plus in Fortified and then in Tyrannical, try to see what differs based on the affixes and all of that. This is something that is not going to be too true for a tank, for example, because for a tank, you don't just have almost the same things that the DPS have to take care of in a Mythic Plus key. Things like interrupts, things like the damage of certain abilities. You also have damage of abilities strictly targeting the tank, tank busters and main melee auto attack damage, things that you have to learn how much damage they hit for in Fortified keys, so more damage when you pull the trash packs, or in Tyrannical keys when it comes to bosses. These are things you have to learn for all the dungeons, all 8 of them in Fortified and then in Tyrannical, and then in all the affixes that can change the number of pulls you can have in the key. For example, things like bolstering, which is going to prevent you from doing certain types of pulls, or things like necrotic, which is also going to prevent you from doing certain type of pulls, as well as things like the new one, inspiring. These are all things that are going to affect the tank when they won't affect the DPSer, right? Because the tank, of course, has to know how much damage can he take if he's going to pull these 2 packs together now that the weak has a necrotic affix. Maybe the weak doesn't have necrotic, but it has Fortified. Can I still do that? Can I not? This is not very effective for people who don't have a lot of time, for people who don't have a lot of time to spend learning these type of things. A DPS can get away with this, even to a degree, not as well as a DPS, but almost. A healer can also get away with this. They can have less time to play, they can be more casual, and they can still go for a plug and play, drop in, drop out, a Mythic Plus key without suffering too much from the lack of experience, as opposed to a tank. So you have now created this problem where tank activities are reduced compared to DPSers and even healers. Less spots for you in the raid, less spots for you in PvP, and then the spot for you in Mythic Plus has a lot of responsibility, a lot of things you have to keep track of, and then it also doesn't reward a, let's call it, salutary playstyle, playing a few times a week, not as much as you would need to learn all of these things properly. All these things combined make it so that tanking is sort of a scare for people to pick up. Now, I said this is an advertisement for tanking. You have to try to get people to play tank, and yet, right now, I've only pointed out awful things. Well, let's try to look at the bright side now, after I pointed out all of these problems that would make you want to not play the tank. Number 1, you can say that easily, playing the tank in Mythic Plus is the most different type of role you can play out of any other role. In raids, in PvP, in Mythic Plus, tank in Mythic Plus is the most different, is the most varied. It has by far effectively the biggest amount of control and the biggest amount of choices you can make that can positively impact the activity you're trying to do. Of course, if you're a negative type of guy, you can also say, yeah, but it also has the most negative impact you can have in the activity you're trying to do if you fuck up. Yes, that's what responsibility means, obviously. But it can really, change the perspective in which you're looking at Mythic Plus. If you're thinking, for example, that Mythic Plus is kind of boring because you are one of those sultry players which just hops in a few Mythic Plus every week as a hunter, just follows the tank, AoEs the packs of mobs, maybe even bothers to interrupt a few times and then thinks, this is not that entertaining, then you are one of the players who could enjoy tanking more, because it is going to open up for you a number of other things you have to keep track of in Mythic Plus, as well as the satisfaction for you of actually pulling those off properly. You might have heard me at this point mentioning multiple times, almost exclusively Mythic Plus, because of course this is the main zone where you're gonna find tank enthusiasts in. Tanking in raids has never been the shining light for tanking for many years and many expansions, from vanilla all the way up to effectively Worlds of Draenor, even before Mists of Pandaria. Tanking was considered rather boring, rather unenthusiastic and rather dull. The options and things and duties Blizzard gave tanks in raids up to that point, up to the first 4 to 5 versions of this game, weren't many. They weren't that difficult, which meant, of course, tanking in raids wasn't that enticing. With the addition of challenge modes, tanking got a whole new world they could express themselves into, and then of course it got elevated even more in Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus is going to be the main source of your activity as a tank if you enjoy it. So of course, with this being said, in trying to get more tanks to play the game, then the first thing you should make sure of is that you enjoy Mythic Plus. Or alternatively, you don't feel like you're enjoying the current Mythic Plus you're playing as a healer or as a DPS. Rather than thinking you're not enjoying Mythic Plus because you're playing Affliction Warlock and you should respect to Fire because Fire is flavor of the month, or maybe because you're trying to play Retribution Paladin and you should go play Unholy, you should instead do the opposite and try to play tank. Now, as for the psychological aspect, there isn't much to be done there. This is something that every player has to overcome by himself. I can have a 101 the human brain course for all of you and trying to tell you how to go past this hurdle by yourself, because everyone is going to be different. People are going to have different ways they are going to react and interact with this type of problems. I'm sure, and I'm not targeting any one of you particularly, that some of you very excitedly thought, oh, I'm gonna tank now, or to some degree, oh, I'm gonna heal now, and then the first time you go into a dungeon, you horribly fuck up and you just Alt F4 in embarrassment and you don't log in for an hour, just in case someone is going to whisper you that you're bad, and you hope they just forget. That is just going to happen to you. It is just going to be natural. You're just going to fuck up. It's expected, and you should just take it in stride. When you tank, you're going to fuck up, and when you tank, your fuck-ups are going to be more important than a DPS fucking up or a healer fucking up, although healers not as much. When a DPS is tanking the frontal of a mob on a fortified key and gets one shot, whatever. You're thinking, what a noob. He rests, you lose 5 seconds, a few more seconds because you don't have the DPS for a while, and that's it. When you're a tank and you fuck up the count on the trash packs and you get to spawn a prideful the pack before the boss, and now you are on tyrannical and you just missed a prideful on the boss, that is going to be a much bigger mistake, which is going to make the party much more annoyed at you than on the other DPS, which has now died 6 times up to this point. So I don't have the actual answer for you on how to get past this block when it comes to the psychological part of tanking. Many people simply won't try tanking. They just can't deal and they can't cope with the extra pressure. I've seen all sorts of justifications / excuses / reasoning. Take it as you will. Things like, I play the game to relax, I play the game to chill, I have more fun doing DPS without too much, hurdles attached to me, rather than playing a tank, having to always be on top of everything, and, keeping up with things like the routes, the pulls, the kiting. It's just too stressful for me, so that is something that is going to hardly change people's minds. But again, remember that as you are a DPS, you're also inherently learning the dungeon. You're not just going in there blind, I hope, unless you're a demon hunter, so you should be, by this point, getting a good amount of information on which pulls are dangerous, which pulls are shaky for a tank. As a DPS, provided we have established you're not blind, you're starting to see yourself which are the pulls that the tanks are trying to kite. Even when it's not necrotic, even when it's not raging, you're seeing certain dangerous packs in Mythic Plus. You're seeing the amount of times your key was depleted because that trash pool just wiped you multiple times, so you know yourself certain packs are difficult. even as a DPS or a healer. So going in as a tank doesn't mean you have to do a full reset, doesn't mean you're starting from scratch, from zero. You do have still picked up quite a few things as a DPS. In fact, most things of a dungeon, you can still pick them up while playing DPS. So you don't even have to completely start from zero as a tank. You can just start thinking about playing tank while you DPS in your Mythic Plus keys and just pay more attention to what the tank is doing and what the pulls, what the trash pulls are doing to the tank, for example. It is going to go effectively a long way for you to simply be more aware in a Mythic Plus key and pay more attention and get, better if you are planning to play a tank. When it comes to raiding though, again, I'm trying to advertise more people to repopulate the tank population, yet I don't feel like pushing you into tanking in raiding because that is going to be actually boring, and also because it's also going to be much more difficult. Not because tanking is more difficult in raids than it is in Mythic Plus, but simply because it is going to be more difficult to find a tanking spot in a raiding guild. Tanking spots are way more, I guess, solid and less volatile than other slots in the raid, so it's going to be much harder for you to actually find a spot as a tank in a raiding group as opposed to Mythic Plus. And also Mythic Plus, of course, is the more casual activity in the sense that way more people can dive into Mythic Plus without having a guild, without having any sort of coordination with other people, so it's much more easy to start tanking while jumping into Mythic Plus. The same is when it comes to healing. So I do believe, even as a DPS and as a healer, mostly as my roles, that tanking is very enjoyable. I have tanked on my alts in Mythic Plus from Legion since now. I've done it on a Blood DK, on a Prot Paladin, on a Protection Warrior, now on a Guardian Druid, and it's just enjoyable because you have control, but some people just don't like it. So I do wish some of you would just jump a little bit more into tanking, because trust me when I say it is really just an entire different way of seeing things when you're doing Mythic Plus. When you're doing content in a dungeon, it is just going to open up for you a whole different type of activity, a whole different type of playstyle compared to DPSing or even healing. It is going to come with a baggage of more responsibility, of having to own up to your mistakes much more. As we know, online games, people don't really like to admit their mistakes. Team-based games are notorious for this. It is much easier for you to not accept your own responsibility when you're in a team game, because you can always blame the feeder, the inter, and the troll in your group, so that you don't take responsibility for your own mistakes. Mythic Plus groups can also be similar. When somebody's fucking up in a group, the DPS can just leave, call them clowns, and pretend he wasn't his fault. For tanking, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to get away with that type of attitude, which is good, because that is a terrible attitude to have in any type of group content. So you're also going to get better as a player when you're trying to tank. I do hope more people get into tanking. I do hope more people try at the very least. This is a pretty good time to get into tanking. We are over 2 months into the expansion. There is a lull phase before 9.1 comes out. Let's just say another 2 months, 2.5 months at least. So you have seen all the dungeons, you have done all the dungeons, you have done them in DPS spec or healer spec. The dungeons have all been nerfed, and you're now getting more and more gear over time, which means you're also getting more powerful. So it is getting easier to tank, to get into the first difficult block, which is going from +10 to +15. So getting to tanking now, before 9.1, before the next raid tier, so you can be ready with your new shiny role to play and to populate the looking for group tool, which is why this advertisement is coming out right now. Now, after this advertisement, we are going to get the one about healers, and then the one about melee DPS and range DPS, although I am not, and I'm telling you right now, advertising anyone to actually go and play DPS. There is already way too many people playing DPS, so please don't. As the videos are going to roll by, we're also going to touch on things like classes and specs, not because of, who is OP, who is not OP, but more so on which of the roles you can actually play when you decide to play a certain class. Because it's easy to say just go and play tank forehead, but then when you have 2 or 3 tanks that are never played, or maybe 2 or 3 healers that are never played, what if you like that particular type of tank or healer? What if you really do enjoy playing a tank, but for some reason something happened in your brain and the only tank you like to play is a protection warrior? Well, that's a problem. We would have to talk about that later on. So for now, I will leave you at the end of this advertisement. In no way, shape, or form I am being paid by the Azeroth Tanking Association for every new tank that joins the Mythic Plus ranks. I deny any accusation. So, see you guys tomorrow, probably, likely. And In the meantime, I guess it's time to learn how to play a tank.